Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it is our honor to invite Dr. Sarah McKay onto the podcast. Dr. Sarah McKay is a neuroscientist who is also the director of the Neuroscience Academy, and she's also written a very intriguing and insightful book called The Women's Brain Book, which in the UK is called Demystifying the Female Brain, and it is a good exploration of health, hormones, and happiness. So we welcome you to the podcast, Sarah. Thank you very much for joining us, and bright and early from Sydney.
Thank you, and it is so great to talk to people from the UK because they just pronounce my name correctly without having to ask.
Yeah, we've got a keen ear for it.
Yeah, none of this Americanized McKay. So thank you. You've made my day already.
Right. Oh, you're welcome. So I'm glad I got that right because I had to make sure. I've heard you say your name a few times. Okay, that's how it's said. Great. Let's get that right.
Yeah. The Scottish don't say McKay.
Right. Yeah, of course. So yeah, lovely to have you. Thanks for joining us. And we thought it'd be a good place to start to talk to you about your journey into neuroscience. What got you actually hooked on exploring the brain and wanting to excel in this field?
Yeah, that is a really interesting question because it's been a while now. I was one of those kids who loved school, and I loved all kinds of science, biology, chemistry, geography. I was just totally loved learning, which always makes me sound like a massive nerd. Maybe I was, but I also had a bunch of great mates, boys and girls. So I had a very happy school life, headed off to university, and was doing psychology in my first year at Canterbury University in Christchurch. And there really was a moment when I went, oh my God. Well, first there was kind of two moments, a dual moment within a lecture where we were learning about synapses, the kind of point-to-point connection between two neurons or brain cells. And they would, the lecturer was just doing the basic kind of description that anyone who's done a biology class would be familiar with about calcium influx and the vesicles and the neurotransmitters. And I was like, this is so cool. This is like the biology of psychology. Wow, I was captivated. And then that lecturer also recommended that we read a new book way back then, which is aging me. This is back in the early 90s, guys. A book called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat by a neurologist, Oliver Sacks, which I think when that book came out, it really sort of inspired a whole generation of neuroscientists. Those of us who were reading it way back then. And Oliver Sacks, for those who don't know, was a neurologist, and it was also an incredible storyteller, and wrote these really curious case studies up of the strange things that happen to people's minds and behaviour when things go wrong with their brain. And these kind of two ideas coming together just utterly captivated me because when I was in school, biology didn't involve I'd never heard about neurons and synapses really until I was in that first year of university. And back then in the early 90s, neuroscience was a brand new discipline within the universities, and actually another university down the road from where I lived, at Otago University in Dunedin, about 4 hours south of where I grew up in Christchurch, had just put together a brand new degree discipline in neuroscience, and they'd pulled the brain or neurocomponents from lots of different disciplines together. And so they were offering that as a new degree, and I went, well, that's me. And so I transferred universities, and off I went, and I've been on that path ever since in various kinds of forms. And it's still, I remember that, like, oh my God, this is a really cool moment. And that was in 1993. And I still have that experience now when I pick up, and I still read neuroscience textbooks and pick up papers. I love that. And just go, this is so cool. It's still it's because it's such a broad, deep subject that's kept me captivated all these years.
Have you seen it? Obviously, have you seen it change over the years as new discoveries happen, or is it similar to how you started?
It's really there's been few giant big leaps forward. It doesn't really work like that. It's just these tiny little steps and growing understanding and new ways of kind of thinking and talking and describing. I mean, the synapses still work in the same way, but now we've got this incredibly detailed understanding of kind of, that we can zoom in and take a look at what's going on and look at all the protein folding and the genes that change when when a synapse is activated. And it's funny because I just bought the main neuroscience textbook that we all used everywhere, Kandel, Jessel and Schwartz, and I just bought the 6th edition, which came out about a month ago. And I've also got the 3rd edition, which I bought in my first year of my neuroscience degree. And so that was really cool to kind of see like these 30 years and chapter summaries.
Yeah.
And to see how that's grown and changed. And some things are similar, but mostly it's just that their knowledge is expanded and grown rather than changed completely. So that's really cool to see, like in a really super nerdy way, some of the stuff that's changed.
I love that.
That's what's fascinating about when you wrote your book, and then pretty much every chapter in your book where you're talking about whether it's from conception through puberty to pregnancy, motherhood, menopause, you're like, we don't know a lot about women's health. And it's amazing that just how far we still have to go in that sense as well.
Yeah, and I think some people see that as a shame, and in some respects it's a shame, but personally for me, I just think there's going to be lots of new stuff to learn about as we're going along over the next few years, because I just have always been deeply driven by that love of learning and finding out new information. Perhaps I was told last night that maybe I've now got a bit too much information and I need to start thinking about some other things. But certainly for me, one of the changes I've seen is that obsession has become less personal, and I just about like me and a few other people have been really into it for a long time. I have started to see other people outside of academia become really interested and curious about neuroscience. I mean, people have always been interested in the brain and the mind and behaviour, and psychology has been around for a very, very long time, and perhaps in some ways offers people more than neuroscience. But I've started to see that real growing interest and enthusiasm from other people wanting to learn.
Yeah, we certainly are. Cool. Yeah. We're not in the scientific field, but we certainly love neuroscience and we're fascinated by everything and how we can incorporate it into what we do as well. So it's really exciting.
Yeah, I'd say so, because I think for me, it kind of helped make a lot of things make sense in terms of why we might do things the way we do or how we do things the way we do, especially when it comes to a lot of psychological advice or philosophy or things like that. Is like, so for example, like ways of life that work for people. Everybody's talking about having, say for example, just like social connection and things like that. And then it was like, okay, well, why is that so important to us? And neuroscience, I felt like, really helped nail that down for us in terms of what it actually does for the brain. And since the brain is kind of like the center of our consciousness and how we perceive life, it's like, okay, well, this is really interesting to see it through this lens, and what else can it offer us? And in your view, what do you think it can offer us to understand, like say the deep health model of like social, existential life as well, even physical, mental health? Where do you think neuroscience can color our way of life so that we can actually live it better?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think it probably does what you suggested at the beginning there, is that it gives you a bit of a why. And some of these ideas we've known. We know that you should eat healthy food, and we know we should get more sleep, and we know we should reduce stress, and we've been told a lot of that for a really long time. And I suppose a lot of scientific disciplines essentially kind of provide the evidence backing that up and then give us the why. Why is sleep so important? Well, we still don't understand everything about why we need sleep. Like, why did we evolve to need it? It seems like a bit of a waste of time. But what a lot of the disciplines do in neuroscience, I suppose, sitting in there, gives us some insights into the why, and that can be really interesting and can reinforce a lot of ideas, and other times can give us some completely new insights that we didn't know that can support ideas about health and well-being, or sometimes counteract them. And that's really what's interesting for me. What I'm starting to see now is Like you use the word colour, and I think that's such a lovely way to think about it. And I suppose I was going to say, for me, it helps connect the dots between ideas. It's connecting the dots and colouring them, and I'm sure we can come up with a really nice analogy between us all here. But for me, that's what it does. It just kind of provides a bit more oomph behind an idea. And I think when we neuroscience can often sort of demystify and depersonalize as well concepts that we think, oh, that's just me and how I think, and so often I think it's just human nature. To understand brain and behaviour reminds us, and so many people have forgotten this, we're really just animals that evolved on the planet along with everything else. Along with my dog asleep on the floor and the birds that are flying around outside my window. We're essentially like that, and in some ways our behaviours can be, reasonably predictable. I have a young teen. I've got two boys who are 11 and 13, and the more and more I've learned about the teenage brain, and so much credit for that must go to Sarah Jane Blakemore, who's in the UK. She's in Cambridge now, who's really kind of pioneered the neuroscience of adolescence. And the more and more I learn about the teenage brain, I can just see these behaviours that some people might think, oh gosh, they're selfish, or teenagers are grumpy, or they do this. And I'm like, it is so predictable. It is so developmentally normal. And so for me personally, it gives me some really great insights that will enable me as a parent to be curious and not judgmental. And that's really useful. My son is not at all interested in hearing about neuroscience, because that's what mum does. They're entirely uninterested and very deeply uncool. And it is very uncool to say uncool. There's probably some other word, I don't know what it is at the moment.
So that's him venturing into finding his own territory, right? Moving away from...
Yeah. It's entirely developmentally normal.
I was going to say, if it helps mum to understand him, my son's 11 as well, if it helps mum to understand him, then I think that helps us to become better parents in a way, right? If we have a bit of understanding behind it and what they're going through with their brain chemistry, that's valuable information, and I need to read that book.
And that kind of leads me to there's a couple of things there, but the first one is understanding like a good model to use to kind of look at the nervous system, look at the brain, because it's clearly it's potentially the most complex thing we've ever encountered in the world, and it resides right in our skull, and we're learning so much about it and realizing at the same time we don't know anything about it while we learn more and more about it. And so the complexity of it, what's a good, so I've seen the way you've described it, which is the top down, bottom up, outside in model to help us understand what is influencing our brain and our nervous system. I love it, and it'd be great if you could just kind of break it down for us so people can understand what it is that's actually influencing the brain, because it's not just genetics, it's not just biology, there's plenty of things going on.
Yeah, there are plenty of things going on, and any aspect of brain that you can think about, from sleep to teenagers being grumpy to risk for Alzheimer's disease to just any kind of question you want to frame in terms of the brain, once you start digging into the research, gets just utterly complex. And so this bottom up, outside and top down model that you're referring to is based on, I must give credit to the biopsychosocial model, which is really a conceptual model of thinking about health and well-being and psychology, whereby there's a biophysiological component, a social component, and a psychological component. But I just think biopsychosocial sort of sounds clinical and really doesn't have the brain in the centre. So thinking about the utter complexity of anything brain and that model, I started talking about, let's put the brain in the middle, and it's very visual for me when I'm describing it. And if I could draw it if this wasn't a podcast, or show you a picture. But essentially the brain is in the middle, and it's receiving a constant stream of data from and conversation with our bottom-up biology, and everything within our bottom-up biology includes, our genes to our hormones to our immune system to parts of the brain that are constantly monitoring, our pH and our heart rate and our core body temperature. And not only is it receiving a constant stream of data from our body, but it's also in conversation back with, because of course we have a nervous system which extends, to the tips of our fingers and toes, controlling our muscles and our internal organs. So there's everything biological that is influencing the brain, and as I kind of say, providing data input to the brain for those who prefer more of a hardware-software model. But our brains and nervous systems evolved not really to think. That's one of the last things that they've mastered, and one of the hardest things for us to master as well, I believe, is thinking. But our brains evolved to move us through the natural world and to regulate that body as we're going in search of whatever's out there that we want to move towards or away from. And so our brains had to evolve then to receive input, receive this data stream from the outside world, primarily through our eyes, but also our ears and as we breathe. And what's out there in the natural world, well, there's obviously the environment in which we live and the light-dark cycle, but there's also all of the other people, because we're these social beings, humans. So much of our behaviour comes about from interactions and expectations and past memories and future events with other people. So there's the outside-in data stream, and that also includes, scrolling through the news feed or whatever. And then finally, we've got top-down, which is really, our memory of lived experiences, our thoughts, our expectations, our belief systems. And these bottom-up, outside-in, and top-down data streams are in constant conversation and constantly coalescing and influencing each other to create any particular state or thought or emotion. It's never just one, it's always a combination of them all. And so the brain kind of almost provides this point via which they can interact, via which our body interacts with the outside world, or our top-down thoughts can influence our physiology, and so on and so on. So I just always place the brain in the middle, and whenever I kind of come back, people think, right, well, let's go back to the teenage brain. Why are teenagers so self-obsessed and so self-conscious? And we can think, well, what's going on? People always just want to fall back on hormones. Well, sure, hormones, of course, are a really large part of puberty and the changes that take place. All of us have been through it. We all know, what it was like. Huge. But their entire social world has changed, because often they've moved from primary school to high school. Their social brain is going through a big phase of development and requires social connections. It's almost going out and seeking that. And really, teenagers need to not be only interacting with mum and dad, they need to be interacting with this broader social world. So there's that outside and input. And then, of course, there's that top-down. Like, teenagers, of course, are thinking about, what are other people thinking about me? Every one of them is thinking that. They're very self-conscious because they're developing that next phase of theory of mind and understanding what other people are thinking. So they're always thinking everyone else is thinking about them, but, of course, every teenager is thinking about themselves. So, we've got these bottom-up, outside, and top-down. There, I've just introduced 3 ideas already to kind of consider if we think about even teenage brain development. So that's sort of how the model works, and I just come back to it time and time again whenever I'm chatting about the brain, because it just is a really useful framework. And it's a useful framework I hope that anyone listening to this will take forward when they've got a question they want to think about, or they read something, or they want to go and research something, that it just enables you to kind of break down the complexity a little bit, gives you a bit of a framework.
Definitely.
Definitely. It's super helpful, because
really helpful.
Yeah, exactly. It's worth realizing that it's not just one thing. It's like because you always hit, you'll see headlines, because neuroscience, I feel like, is becoming a bigger thing in not just popular science, but in conventional wisdom. And so, it's something that I'll bring up maybe later on, but everybody used to say, talking about dopamine and dopamine this and dopamine fasting, and for example, which so you have to consider actually, scrap the headline. What's a good way of looking at it, and then looking at it from
really lovely way of looking at it.
So it's a really helpful way to do it.
We're so, as humans, we're not walking around with these brains inside a body and that's it. And I think I sometimes wonder, the world of sort of self-help and well-being. It encouraged us to spend so much time only listening to that bottom-up data stream that we spend so much time navel gazing, or, you know, when we talk about women's health, ovary gazing, that it's encouraged us to be quite sort of lonely and isolated in a way, and that we're only kind of thinking about the body.
Introverted,
And we have you know, everything is contextual. So many of our social interactions influence our physiology. And you know, so if we keep coming back to this model, it also reminds us to keep all these other things in play, instead of just solely focusing on that bottom-up data stream.
I think that's so helpful as a mother, for sure. When you're thinking about your children, I think it's really helpful to think of it with all those different factors, because it's very easy to focus in on one thing. And actually, when you sit back and think about all those different things, that's super helpful. Also, as a person, you're going through, like I think you said in your book, that many mothers, as their children reach puberty, they're starting to head into perimenopause, and there's this clash. When you can sit back and think about all those different factors, I think that's so helpful. So
and it's not just there's these two sets of hormones which are trying to sort of fighting it out. It just enables you to, and having all this information, for me, I don't know whether it's useful for anyone else or they're still confused, it just enables me to sit back and look and remove all of the judgment and the emotion from it, and just sit back and look dispassionately at what may be going on and what can we do. So the great example I always give about my teenage son is, sorry, I'm just getting some feedback. Can you hear that? I could just hear my own voice.
Yeah, it's gone now.
Sorry, is, you know, his drive to be with his friends, and literally it is a drive, it is a motivation, it's a need in him. He called me on the phone the other day, as he always does, and he's coming home from school, because it's about a kilometre walk from the bus, bless him, to walk from the bus home. And he said, can you pick me up? And I'm like, okay, darling, because he always knows I'm around in the afternoon, so I went and picked him up. He gets in the car and how was your day? I know. And that's fine. He just wants to chill. I let him. He comes home, gets something to eat, goes upstairs. He smashes out about 10 wheat bits in an afternoon after having 12 for breakfast. He lives on wheat bits.
Wow.
Comes downstairs, he's changed, he's got a rugby ball under his arm. He says, I'm going to meet my mates at the Oval, which is a kilometre and a half walk in the opposite direction. I'm like, do you want me to drop you off? He's like, no. He's got the energy suddenly to walk because the drive is so strong. There was not a lot of drive to come home to mum, except for the fact that I would help him get there. But he had this strong drive. And instead of going, well, isn't he selfish? I'm like, that is so developmentally normal and interesting, because I can see the actual drive to be with his mates is so strong it overcomes any tiredness that he was feeling earlier. And that's just mean I can remove any judgment and sort of storytelling in my own head and go, that's really cool, because he's behaving as he should.
And that's incredibly, it's incredibly useful as well. And that's like, you know, that's busting some misconceptions as well. It's just one of the things I wanted to ask you about, which was through the lifespan, especially through the female lifespan, there's a bunch of things that people might believe, which isn't necessarily true. And some of like the common misconceptions that you might have come across that, you know, are worth to basically obliterate and just throw them out the window. So from, like, you know, you're talking about teenage years there, for example, which is, for sure. I can remember times of my behavior thinking, I'm glad my parents had the patience with me, and then going into later life stages like pregnancy, motherhood, and then further down the line into menopause. Like, we can tackle each area as you see fit, but like, what are the common misconceptions that people have, which is kind of hindering their ability to enjoy life and to the fullest, which you think is worth them knowing?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's probably, if we could kind of look at a few different phases, because there are lots of, and it'll just give us a chance to kind of talk about this model a little bit more too. So I think if we start at puberty, because we're already kind of there talking about teenagers, because that's really when we start talking a lot about the bottom-up signalling and the hormones. And an interesting study that I came across in my research, so when I went in to write this book, know a bit about brain plasticity during development and a little bit about aging, and I didn't know anything about hormones or neuroendocrinology, but I know lots of people to ask the questions of. So often the journey of writing the book and doing the research was going, oh, well, that is interesting, isn't it? And I had for me, it was just joyful learning new things. But the puberty one was interesting because, again, we have a tendency to blame hormones when things go wrong, particularly in women. We never talk about all of the great things hormones do. We just blame them typically for negative mood. And longitudinal studies are always really interesting because they typically involve really large cohorts of people who are studied in a great amount of detail as they sort of track through their lifespan. And there's an Australian longitudinal study of childhood, which is looking at the development of children from, sort of 4 or 5 all the way through to their late teenage years. And they study every aspect of these kids' lives, and they provide a real rich sort of literature of research. And in these kids, they were looking at the onset of puberty, the age of onset of puberty, and the development of mental health disorders. Because typically we do start to see the emergence of particularly anxiety and depression in those early teenage years. And that's also when we start to see a bit of a gender divide as well. And so often parents go, oh, well, they're moody because of their hormones. But what was interesting was if we looked at kids entering puberty at different ages, and if we looked at girls entering puberty early but normal, so younger than their friends but still on the normal scale there, say they were starting to develop breasts at 9, 10 and got their periods at maybe 10-ish, which is early but it's still normal. Those girls are far more vulnerable to go on to develop mental health problems. It's not guaranteed by any stretch of the imagination, but they're more vulnerable, they're more at risk than a girl who enters puberty at the same age as the majority of her friendship group. Or the girl who enters slightly later. But boys are a little bit different because boys who enter puberty slightly ahead of their friends, they get taller and hairier and more muscly, and they actually rise in social stature in their friendship group, which in a sense protects them and makes them a little less vulnerable and a bit more resilient versus that little guy. And we all remember them from high school, that the little guy who didn't grow until he was about 15 or 16, and he's far more vulnerable. So in fact, what we were seeing was children experiencing pubertal hormones for the first time, which kickstarts all of the physical body changes, but also kickstarts the trajectory of adolescent brain development. But we're seeing that what was the determinant was the children's perception of themselves in comparison to their friendship group. So it was actually the outside-in signal was a big, big part of that. It wasn't just pubertal hormones. It's, hey, what's happening to me in my body in relationship to all of my friends? It's almost like that comparison that each child makes was a big part of that. And we know that a large part of any anxiety or depression risk is as a social connection or disconnection component. So I thought that was really, really interesting. And that sort of idea did play out at a lot of other points during the lifespan where PMS was one of the big ones that blew my mind. This idea that that's a purely hormonal issue, right? And I went into doing the research on the menstrual cycle, and let's look at how the brain changes over the course of a month in a healthy cycling woman. Does it impact cognition, this monthly hormonal cycling? Does it impact emotions? And there's actually a substantial amount of research in this space. So that was pretty cool because lots of the time I would go in and ask questions and there would be not a ton of research. But in terms of we've all, 50% of the population has kind of got this monthly neuroscience experiment going on. So that was really interesting to dig into that. And I was heartened, my little feminist beating heart was heartened to see that in terms of cognition, so what we might think about is all of our thinking skills, planning and judgment and decision making and reasoning and attention and problem solving were not influenced over the course of the month. There was very little data at all saying you're better at paying attention or you're worse at making decisions or you're better at thinking at this time of the month or another, which is good for those of us who, hold down jobs and we're educated and, we managed to kind of get through despite the fact we may have a monthly cycle. So woohoo for that. And I'm a Kiwi, obviously, and was kind of unaware. I don't know whether it's my Kiwi upbringing. Was kind of unaware for the last few years that apparently being a female was a hindrance to life. I don't know. We've done Kiwi women do all right. That's not to say that's my personal experience. I must say, a lot of the discussions recently, I'm like, apparently there's women in STEM as a issue that lots of women grapple with. It was like I hadn't noticed, but that's not my personal experience. I have to be careful to assume everyone's has been similar. But anyway, so then I started digging into the research about emotions. I thought, well, women are very emotional and hormonal, apparently. Although as a Kiwi, I was not really brought up with that story, let me say. It was not part of conversations growing up in my family. I went to an all-girls school, was taught by nuns. Nuns are, social justice warriors. It was like feminist boot camp, go and do anything. I wasn't brought up with any of that. You're very emotional, at particular times in the month, and we were fragile. I was not brought up that way. So that has coloured some of my attitudes, I have to say. But the research on emotions was kind of similar in that when we look at very specific measures of particular emotions, the data was not showing any clear variation based on hormonal status or day of the month, which is counter to many women's lived experiences. And I thought, well, I better check out PMS.
Yeah,
that apparently is a thing. Again, was not a thing when I was growing up, but so the first thing I'd always do when I was doing research was like, I better go and check the stats on how many women experience PMS. I thought that'll be straightforward. It was not straightforward. I came across a meta-analysis, and I try always to, look to the top of the pyramid of research. And a meta-analysis, for those who don't know, I'm probably teaching you guys to suck eggs, is when you pull together data from lots of different research studies that have been done, and there's power in numbers. The more data you've got, the more data points you've got, the more, certainty you can make a claim. And the PMS data was fascinating because it was looking at it globally, but the rates varied. I couldn't believe how much the rates varied of women putting their hands up saying, I suffer from PMS, depending where in the world you live. So at one end of the scale, we have French women, and there was about 10% of them put their hands up and say, I suffer PMS. Okay. Spanish woman, just over the border from France, it was more about 30%. Right. And then you could go into some parts of the world, say Asia, Japan, and it might be about 50% of women. And then you can go, the 95% of women put up their hands saying, I suffer from PMS in Iran. So we have somewhere between 10 and 95% of women putting up their hands to say I suffer from PMS. Wow. But it depends where in the world you live, what the average rate was. And I was like, this is nuts. So it averaged it out at about 50%, but it varied between 10 and 95 depending where in the world you live. And I was
unreal.
For that being hormonal. And then, of course, that appealed to me growing up in this kind of Kiwi culture where we were probably like the French woman, perhaps. So I turned to, funnily enough, research partly done by a Kiwi, also called Sarah Romans, who's a women's health psychiatrist in partnership with a group in Canada. And they were also curious about this. And Sarah Romans in particular is a women's health psychiatrist. So she sees a very narrow subset of women, obviously, who have psychiatric needs. But she said there was this constant leaning on hormones as being the kind of the cause for any emotional ill. And so they designed a really clever study. I'm kind of going on a bit here.
That's great.
Should try and
so
tell
good.
the story a bit quicker. But I was so fascinated by it.
So good.
They designed this mood and daily life study. So there was like an app on your phone, and it popped up saying, "Hey, as a reminder, write down record the following." And it was like, let's look at mood, and it gave a positive and a negative valence of mood and neutral, which is really important because often when women are asked to record mood, they might be given sad, angry, frustrated, and happy. And there might be way more negative moods to choose from and maybe just one positive. So it gave equal numbers of positive, negative, and emotional kind of the scale to pick from, which is pretty important. Asked for, how stressed out are you feeling? Are you feeling physically well or not? Are you feeling socially supported? What's that kind of social connection like in your life? What day of the month are you on? And I gathered all that data. Now, tellingly, the women were not told it was a study on PMS. It's just this mood and daily life study. And when all of the data was crunched and they looked at there was no clear correlation between hormonal status or day of the month and mood. In fact, the stronger prediction of mood was how stressed you felt, your physical health, but the strongest predictor was actually social support.
I was going to say outside, yeah.
Yeah, it was that outside. And now there were some women, so this is again as an average, and all studies look at averages and there's always outliers. There were about sort of 1 to 2 in 20 women, so kind of in that 5 to 10% range that did show clear variation of mood influenced by hormonal status, but 90% didn't. So the women in this study were more like French women. But it's interesting because when the study is done saying we're looking at PMS, the data shifts because it's almost as if we were priming women to expect that we were looking for data about negative emotions in that pre-period phase, which I think is really, really, really interesting. Now, this is not to say that any woman's lived experience of feeling cranky at this time of the month isn't real, but it's what we are attributing that to and the meaning that we are making of that based on the stories that we believe or the messaging that we've taken on board, or even perhaps tuning in our brain to a signal that we may have been taught to ignore. Not really sure what's going on here, but a lot of the feminist narrative and literature around this would say that women are kind of being good women and ignoring their emotions, and then there's a few days of the month where we feel empowered and able to kind of release because we've been told it's okay to be cranky bitches at that point in time. And interestingly, other analyses that have been done do tend to show that in countries where there's less gender equality, rates of PMS are slightly higher. So I think that's a really interesting way to think about this, not to say hormones aren't important or social support is the reason for PMS, just to say there's bottom up, there's outside and there's top down influences at play, even for something that we might think is a hormonal issue. So I think that's so, that just totally blew my mind. And actually had similarities to the pubertal study of kids. You know, it's outside in and top down and bottom up are all coalescing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
I think there's, it just made me think like how I got into finding out more about this stuff essentially was I've got a postmenopausal client. I had a client who now is approaching menopause and curious about this stuff, and then I had one who was in menopause, and then over the last couple of years I've had friends who have given birth to their first child, so they've spent time being pregnant and now are mothers, and I just realized I got a real blind spot around female health. Is like I coach people to become physically healthier and better, but this was one area where if push came to shove and I had to make some, base some advice on what I tell them to do based on their own health, their own female health perspective, it was like, okay, I don't really know much here. And it's like, so it was good. So somehow the universe just kind of spoke out. I really have no idea how I came across your profile on Instagram, Sarah. I just can't remember. I've been trying to piece it together. I was just like, I don't actually know how it happened, but I ended up stumbling across it. It was just perfect timing because you wrote the book. And the point there is that it's super useful for us, for me as a man to understand what's going on there, not just because I coach women, but also because I have women in my life as well. And so that understanding, and it's like just that constant, what's been said plenty of times before is, oh, stay away from them, must be PMS or something like that. It's like, okay, it's that time in the month.
Yeah, actually,
and it's
maybe
like,
it's your fault.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, maybe it's my fault, but it's like, what's interesting there is like when you look at it from that outside in, top down, bottom up model, is like, well, okay, there is potentially, and like, am I potentially contributing to this as well? Or is it that you're in a stressful situation, you actually need my support, you actually need me to lean in, not to back away?
And I think,
things like that.
You're such a lovely bloke. I always say this, parts of people go, men, they don't want to talk about women's health, it makes them feel ostracized, and you're like, you've leaned into it. So that's I always say it's a book for women and the men who love them and work with them. So good on you for like wanting to learn all of this. And I think there's so many other situations where we blame hormones, and we tend to blame hormones when things go wrong. We don't think about the wonderful things they do. We can talk about pregnancy and how amazing estrogen is, but other people so often were at every point in the lifespan, when I was looking at the research, were the kind of the best thing or the worst thing for a brain. They were the main sort of data input, or the structural support that we can provide was with other people, which is really great because we can do something about that. We might not necessarily be able to manipulate someone's hormones to make them feel better or worse, but as people, we can go in and make an enormous difference. So I think that gives people so much agency.
Do you think women
towards a positive change?
I was going to ask, do you think women can almost egg each other on with certain symptoms and things like that? You know, like male partners, and it's like, it's her time of the month. Do you think women could also potentially, I'm cranky today, yes, so am I, you're on, do you know what I mean? So
I think that storytelling and the meaning we make is as an important data point as any, in terms of our brain deciding. Well, our brain doesn't decide things. It's being a bit dualist, but essentially any state that we find ourselves in is the meaning that we're making of that is as important. And we saw that, the study where we'll tell the women that the studies about PMS versus not, the data that that influences the outcome, because part of any health outcome is based on our expectation and how we feel about that.
Yes.
And pregnancy, if you just indulge me to talk about pregnancy and the stories that we use to egg each other on, is there's some really cool research that's come out recently around the human maternal brain, which has been great because we know quite a bit about the maternal brain, the brains of females as they go through pregnancy, and the little scurrying animals of the lab. And interestingly, the experience of most female mammals, humans aside, is that pregnancy makes you smarter. It improves your cognition. You're better at paying attention. You make better decisions. You have much better memory. You build in a lot of resilience, and that lasts for the lifespan. So, in fact, mothers outside of humans typically, and humans too, as it turns out, typically sort of live longer, healthier, more resilient lives. Us humans read books on what to expect when we're expecting.
Yeah.
Therefore, we have a lot of expectation in there. There's a lot of storytelling. There's a lot of meaning making around motherhood, and that's an enormous influence over our experiences for the better and for the worse. And if we look at this great study came out when I was writing the book, from a group led by a woman called Elseline Hoeksma in the Netherlands, and she's since published more research after my book has come out, taking a look at how the brain changes in human women across the course of a first pregnancy. So they get a lot of women in, and their husbands and partners as well, and scan their brains when they're trying to fall pregnant, and then immediately after a first pregnancy, and then subsequent times afterwards. They don't want to put women in the MRI scanner unnecessarily during the pregnancy. And all the women's brains showed the same structural changes across or immediately after their pregnancy. And the really interesting thing was the parts of the brain that showed structural change were involved in social cognition and theory of mind and empathy. So again, we've got this largely biological signal, like being pregnant is a big deal to your body and your brain and your mind. And actually the parts of your brain that change are those involved with the outside and with that social connection with other people, which is utterly fascinating, that Mother Nature doesn't just prepare our bodies to carry the baby and to nurture the baby after it's born, but it also prepares our brains and our minds for the act of mothering, whereby we have a far greater skill set in terms of thinking what someone else is thinking and feeling. And lots of women sort of experience this themselves through, particularly in a first pregnancy. It's almost for many women the first time in your life when you see the starving child on TV that used to be in a country far away, and suddenly you feel like your heart's been ripped out. You've just developed this emotional empathy that you never really had before. And that's just kind of Mother Nature's shortcut to ensure the survival of the baby, which is really cool. And we think that comes about by these enormous hormonal shifts that we see during pregnancy. and the main one being estrogen. So we get 1,000-fold dose of estrogen in one pregnancy, 1,000 times more in that one go than we get the entire rest of our lifespan.
Wow.
And in all of the mammals, the female mammals of the animal kingdom, that provides cognitive enhancement. But we are busy talking about baby brain. So what's going on there? You get a bunch of women into the research lab who are pregnant, and again, this is a reasonably well-studied area. We can even do meta-analyses on this. Most of the women aren't showing any cognitive shift whatsoever. They're not scoring worse on tests. Their memory hasn't failed them, but lots of women say that it has, which again for me as a Kiwi was interesting because I've never heard about baby brain either. I don't know what we talked about in New Zealand growing up, but I never heard about baby brain until well after my boys were born. And I was like, well, I'm not getting enough sleep, so I'm tired. Maybe that's why I'm forgetful. Or your attention is really, especially your first pregnancy, it's such a big deal. It's really hard to focus because you're always thinking about what's happening in your belly and this little human you've got. And here's another really interesting link, which perhaps will enable us to carry on the conversation to menopause, is that you run hot when you're pregnant, one, because of some of the hormone shifts, but two, because you've got, especially in the final trimester, you've got another whole human inside you, and so you're really hot. And as soon as we see a subtle shift in core body temperature, sleep architecture gets disrupted, whether you notice it or not, and often we are woken up. You find it harder to fall asleep, and you wake up at night and you can't get back to sleep. And a large part of that's the physical discomfort, particularly in the third trimester. But a large part of that is this sort of shift in core body temperature. And as soon as you shift core body temperature, even by the tiniest amount, and even men experience this in a heat wave, young, fit, healthy men, it's too hot, you can't sleep. That's because core body temperature and sleep are really, really reliant on each other.
Yeah.
So that it may be, I'm a big believer in this, that a lot of these cognitive and emotional shifts that we're seeing, the so-called baby brain, is the lack of sleep. It's not because the hormones made us dumb. In fact, the hormones are working as hard as they can in the other direction. It is, a combination of these other factors in play.
Yeah,
that's amazing. Could I also ask, Sarah? So you were talking about as we become mothers, we crave that social interaction. We become almost like more. It's a requirement that we need. What do you think the effect of, some mothers, the solitary, they don't have that help, they don't have that network, they don't have that village, especially in the pandemic. I've heard of so many new mothers being so stuck. And I wonder what the effects of that would be,
You just hope that they have been locked down with a supportive bloke or partner. However, you hope that the majority of them have had, I suppose some part of it has to have been, we have to have a bit of a mindset shift around that. And for years, in many parts of the world still, you stay cocooned at home, in those first few months of baby's life. People kind of come in and help. And you hope for many women that they've been able to enable that with their partner, or that they're lucky enough to have someone with them that can kind of provide that, because essentially that's what's needed. The focus is on mum and baby and kind of cocooning. Whereas we tend to think, come on, we get our, yoga pants on and nice stroller and go out to mother's group, and that's where the support is. Yeah. That's kind of what we've been told, modern women do and need. So, we do need to sort of think about our expectations around that. But certainly, there's very, very clear evidence that support, the social support around women, is a massive indicator in terms of mental health issues. Yeah. And interestingly, some of that, again, I really like looking at longitudinal data, looking to see around rates of depression in mothers. Certainly the Australian longitudinal data, looking at many thousands of women, there is this vulnerability in that first time after giving birth, because it's an enormous shock. Especially your first birth is just like, gosh, it's an enormous big thing that happens to you. We all remember. Everything is changed, and you're vulnerable, particularly early on. But the rates of depression actually sort of are slightly higher in mothers who have children who are around ages 3 and 4 versus newborns, probably because part of the focus is on supporting the new mums. But once you've been at it for like 2, 3, 4 years, you might have a couple more kids. you just want out. All these expectations you had about what kind of mother you would be, you've typically put well aside, and it's not really living up to this dream that you thought. For many of us, that, you know, the day-to-day slog is really hard, and I know those preschool years were enormously tough. Interestingly, I say to my husband now, who works from home, he goes into the city 1 or 2 days a week now, I said, would it be nice if COVID had have happened before the boys started school? Because you would have been here all the time instead of coming home at 9 at night. So for me, it was an incredibly lonely time, because you were just there with these little kids in the slog. So, you know, again, there's a lot going on that can determine a mother's experience there, and a large part of it again is the social support networks that you have around you. They fall down, everything can easily unravel from there.
That's fascinating.
I think that's one of those kinds of times in life where a lot of pressure gets put on someone to just, like, right now, the moment your child is born, you are a mother. But I think you made a nice point in your book, which was, okay, the baby may have come along, but a mother is not a mother in that moment. You start to learn how to become a mother. So you have all these, you know, mixed emotions around, okay, well, no, there's no denying that, you know, my kid is here, I love my child, but I'm not ready. I'm not ready to take on responsibility, but there's actually no issues with that whatsoever, because your life is completely changed in a moment, but we're only good at dealing with that by learning through experience. And by other people showing us and teaching us. And some people pick it up really quickly, and some people struggle enormously. And I think we're, you know, a lot of the support care systems, I assume it's sort of run similarly in the UK, is that there are a lot of support services. The last year and a half has been so tough for so many people. But there are those kind of early years support services, and they're important for the mum, the parent, whether they be mum or not. Any parent needs that, but also the child needs that, because the child needs to be cared for as well by people who are able to cope. So one of the another, again, I keep going back to these wonderful longitudinal studies, the Dunedin study, and I refer to this a lot in the book, has followed and I'm always slightly envious, because these people were born in the mid-70s in Dunedin. I was born in the mid-70s just up the road in Christchurch, and they've been studied in great detail. There's just over 1,000 of them across, you know, the course of their lives. They're now in their mid-40s, the Gen Xers. And one of the chaps heading up the research group is Richie Poulton. And he said to me when I was doing the research for the book, we've underestimated the importance of childhood. We've kind of known it was important, but their data shows how incredibly significant it is on brain development, on psychosocial health outcomes in your 40s, early childhood. And that's why we need to support mum. We need to support parents, so that these little people that are born into, they have no choice what world they're born into, are given every opportunity possible. I've been coming across other people saying the same sort of thing. There's a researcher out in Canada, Richard Tremblay, who does, I think, like juvenile delinquency and stuff, is what he was researching, and then he moved into aggression, and he said people have asked him, okay, well, how do we stop I think his particular research arm is childhood aggression developing into, you know, male delinquency, and going on that line. And then you ask him, is okay, well, how do we stop that from happening? He says we actually have to raise good mothers, because it's when they are children that like, you know, the socioeconomic status, some of the things you've also pointed out in the book, like socioeconomic status, low education level, means that it passes on to the kids, and the kids end up having a worse outcome in life as well. So it's like, actually, if we start with the children, then we're creating much better outcomes. The only problem is we're looking at something now where the return on investment is 20, 30 years down the line, and most people don't like making an investment in return when it's further down the line like that. But
and we see that, and that's, I mean, I suppose you could call it a snowball effect, and we see it in positive ways as well, whereby the people who are sort of in theory, we might say thriving or flourishing in their mid-40s from the Dunedin study are those that had the best start to life and whose parents probably also had the best start to life. And if you had a good start to life, you should be, the more I learn, the more thankful I am to my mum and dad for giving me this wonderful, stable home, and my husband's parents similarly for giving him a really wonderful, stable home. Now we say to our kids, you are so lucky that we were brought up by the parents we were brought up with, because we had such good start to life that and we both came from, I mean, my parents both left school at 15. I'd never met anyone who'd been to university before, but I was brought up, I mean, not with a lot of money and not with a lot of intellectual, sort of educated family, but I was brought up with so much love and so much kindness. And, that has just, that, I mean, you don't need the other things. That set me up so well. And I think, my boys are so lucky that they happen to be born into a family where we can, continue to kind of foster that. And it's the kids that would fall through the cracks that we really need to pay attention to, because they're still, we can still do a lot. And I said to Richie, if we focus so much on early childhood, what about the ones who didn't have the good start to life? And he said, in typical Kiwi style, you're asking me if they're screwed. And I said, well, maybe I am. And he said, well, sometimes you see these remarkable turnarounds with people who you think that there might not be, they might be screwed, as he said. And it can just be the love, and it's typically the love of one other person. It might even be a therapist. It might be an auntie or an uncle who's come in, or a teacher or a mentor, someone who has just swooped in at a certain point in time, and often during adolescence, who's just kind of provided that social support and that care and connection and attachment that they needed. And he said, we can see remarkable turnarounds, but when one other person becomes involved in someone's life. So, early childhood is so important, but there are other points in the life when we can intervene as well and, pull people up. And, we often, you often hear these remarkable stories of that, and it certainly plays out in the research too.
Sarah, I was going to ask you just about trauma and stress and the effects of babies in the womb as well. And would there be an effect? For example, say the mother was incredibly stressed, there was trauma, would it have an effect on the baby? And can it be stored in their memory as well, or in their body in some way?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And there's people, of course, deeply interested in this, and there is research on this, which is pretty good. So I can speak, based on data. And I think the first thing to point out is that when we talk about stress that can affect the baby, babies are pretty well protected, and the placenta is an amazing organ that buffers an awful lot of stuff. And normal levels of maternal angst and worrying if your baby's doing okay, worrying if you're going to be a good mum, and worrying if you're eating the right food, all that kind of level of psychological stress is fine. In fact, mothers who are slightly psychologically stressed about whether they're going to be good mothers are probably going to be more than enough good mothers. But we do have studies that have looked at extreme stress and extreme trauma, and particularly like disaster type scenarios. So some of the really interesting research that's been done in this space is looking at what's called the Montreal ice storm study. So I think that the kids who were in utero at that time are probably in their early 20s now. So we're going back 20 odd years, and there was one of these ice storms that kind of hit that part of the world, whereby the rain freezes overnight and it collapsed the entire electrical grid in Montreal. And it's really cold there at that point in time. And a lot of people in the city had to be evacuated for quite some time. And there was a researcher there who was already looking at the effects of extreme stress on women who were pregnant. And so she was able to carry on studying those women who had been evacuated from the city during their pregnancy and look to see in the outcomes in some of the kids. And there were some subtle outcomes, particularly emerging in early childhood, whereby a lot of the children's health and development indicators, there were differences in the mothers who had experienced evacuation and found it really difficult. And that was a big part of it as well. It's also your perception of how incredibly stressful and difficult this is. Maybe, someone was able to swoop in and pick you up in a car and drive you away, and you could go and live in, your mum's house in another province for a few months and be well looked after. That was perhaps different than someone who was evacuated into perhaps a school hall. You know, there's different degrees there of the perceived amount of stress. And there were indicators that showed that the children's outcomes were impacted by that. Interestingly, they did start to resolve as the kids went through. And part of that may be these kids were in a study, everyone knew that they'd been impacted, and so then interventions could be made. And these kids weren't like, if they were showing indicators of early, perhaps delayed development or learning problems or behavioural problems, they didn't just let these kids flounder. They were able to then intervene. And so once these kids were reaching teenagehood, they were pretty much, the differences had started to disappear. Maybe some of the girls might have entered puberty slightly younger, which we do see as a result of early stress, etc. But I think that shows that interventions also can help. And I believe similar studies are being done around women who are pregnant during, say, Hurricane Katrina. I know many studies have been done looking at the Christchurch earthquake cohort, which, you know, my whole family and friendship group went through back in 2011. The whole city basically fell down, and studies have been done looking to see children starting school, what are their behavioural and psychological outcomes based on early childhood stress, and it is apparent, but it's manageable.
Was there a difference between boys and girls, or was it similar within the trauma? Interestingly,
in utero stress and trauma, boys are slightly more vulnerable. And we understand, I mean, if we look at, say, neurodevelopmental disorders, boys are slightly more vulnerable. And we're not entirely sure whether that's to do with the boys' makeup themselves, the fact that they're genetically male, or perhaps it's something to do with the genetically male placenta, because placentas are male or female because they basically come, you know, they are part of that you know,
that's
fertilized
amazing.
gamete. Yeah, they don't grow out of the mother; they grow out of the fertilized egg.
That's just amazing.
So you've got a male, you've got a male placenta or a female placenta, and male placentas may be slightly less resilient to buffering things that go on within the mother versus females. That's one theory that's out there. So there is often in these studies a slight tendency towards boys being more affected by in utero stress, and during in childhood. So the Christchurch earthquake cohort, for example, there was not a lot of difference between boys and girls. However, once we get through to the teenage years, stress and trauma impacts girls more. Now, again, bottom up, outside and top down, what's going on? Why are teenage girls more vulnerable to developing anxiety after a traumatic event versus boys? Is it hormonal? That could be a little part of it. Is it perceptual? Is it the stories girls ruminate over and ruminate together about, which girls do more so than boys, who don't tend to talk about it as much? They'll, you know, have different ways of coping that may be learned. Again, we don't know the answer because it's going to be multifactorial.
Wow, that's really interesting.
Are there any theories, or is there any established reason why the male placenta is not as good at buffering against the female placenta? Because I just find it fascinating. I think it's incredible. It's like there's a difference there.
Yeah.
Look, I haven't looked at the research since I wrote that, but we're not entirely sure. But certainly, I don't think most people realise that the placenta's male or female as well.
That's incredible.
You know, who knows? But that's one possibility. I'm not sure what the latest research is saying on that one.
Yeah, okay. Cool. So we'll accelerate a few years into menopause. So I think because again, a whole area which is probably like maybe the least understood out of the lot, and especially by regular folks. Where would you begin to explain, like, you know, what's actually going on with menopause, and how we can better deal with it as somebody who's going through it and people around the people who are going through it?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's a reproductive transition. It's a hormonal transition because your ovaries are sort of winding down their duties and producing less estrogen and progesterone to communicate with your brain. But it's also very largely a neurological transition. And we know hormones are in constant communication with the brain. And as I've said, they're one signal that's coming in. I like to think of them as a modulator. You've got an old-fashioned radio and you can twiddle the volume and the bass and the balance and the treble. So they're just kind of tuning in and out to signals. They're not like the sound coming out of the radio, but they enable things to be twiddled a bit. And so we know that the hormones are in constant conversation with the brain during perimenopause, those years. It could be 5, 10 years leading up to a woman's final period, which is her menopause. Then that conversation that's been kind of going along for most of her lifespan since she hit puberty sort of starts to wind down. And what we actually see is kind of roller coastering levels of hormones. And it's these big fluctuations which are responsible for a lot of the symptoms that women experience. Now, from the brain perspective, the most well established we understand is the hot flashes and the night sweats, which are these what we call thermoregulation issues. And there's a pretty clear sort of biological pathway established whereby we know hormones are involved with tweaking, things a little nod to the radio again, tweaking your thermostat in a region of your brain called your hypothalamus. So typically when your core body temperature rises, that sends signals to your body to start sweating or behaviours to start taking off clothes. And if you get too cold, you'll start shivering or you'll put more clothes on or you'll turn the heating on. During menopause, that perimenopause, the fluctuating hormones we think kind of narrow the thermostats. The top level comes down, the bottom level goes up. So even the tiniest little shift, your brain perceives as you're very, very, very hot. And so you're far more likely to sweat. You're far more likely to go red. You're far more likely to, we'll call it vasodilation, or have this hot flashes, which many women find uncontrollable. So that's that, and we know that it's regulated by hormones, because in women who choose to take hormone therapy, also known as hormone replacement therapy, that's the best treatment we've got for hot flashes and hot flushes. Also, women who are, kind of aerobically fitter, we know that thermoregulation and aerobic fitness are also related. So if you're kind of athletically fitter, you may be more able to, your thermostat might not be as vulnerable to the hormones. And there's some really interesting research that's just come out recently in the UK, I believe, using cognitive behavioural therapies to help women manage hot flashes and hot flushes, which was done in women who are receiving cancer treatment, which again, the fluctuations in hormones can cause these thermoregulation issues. And that doesn't necessarily reduce the number of them, but it reduced that distress women feel around that. So again, there's lots of kinds of ways in to look at that. Now, what I think perhaps is an under-recognised sort of domino effect of sorts, again, goes back to these changes in your core body temperature. You're kind of running a bit hotter. Your thermoregulation isn't as well managed if you're not on hormones. And then what happens, we've got sleep and we've got thermoregulation, which I've already said are very intimately related and dependent on each other. And if you're running hotter, your sleep architecture is disrupted. The same thing happens in healthy, fit young men. If it's too hot outside, sleep architecture is disrupted. Obviously, women, who have experienced it know, you wake up at night sweating, they throw the covers off, then they get cold, so they put the covers back on, and so sleep can be disrupted consciously, or the architecture of sleep, how much time you spend in deep sleep and REM sleep, can be disrupted even if you're not realising it. And what happens even if you lose one night's sleep? You're forgetful, you can't concentrate, you feel foggy, you're less well able to manage your emotions. Have that happen for weeks and months and years, it's very, very easy to start slipping into depression, anxiety, insomnia, because those are kind of cyclical, almost cycles which emerge. So, I think that may be a large part of what is going on in many women in terms of symptomology.
I was going to ask you actually about that, because a lot of my clients are either perimenopausal or going through the menopause, and they've gone to their doctors, and the doctors are very, very young. They're not keen to test them, first of all, blood test them, and they pretty much throw antidepressants at them, first of all, and sleeping tablets before they'll give them HRT. And I wonder why that is. I know that obviously you can suffer from depression, you can suffer from insomnia, but why not the investigation into and willingly give them HRT when it clearly is that time of life.
Yeah, I suppose different countries kind of lag or, speed ahead in terms of some of this understanding. And 20 years ago, everyone was put on HRT, or women were put on HRT, and then we had the women's health studies that came out around 2002, 2003, which scared everyone, scared the GPs, scared the women, because it seemed to indicate that if you were on HRT, your increased risk of cancer and heart disease and stroke and Alzheimer's disease skyrocketed. So about 50% of women globally stopped HRT. And we haven't really sort of started with this whole generation of women has come through the system, and a whole generation of doctors who are like, well, that's not an option.
Right.
That causes disease. But what we understand now is that those studies have been done, the data's been kind of segmented out and looked at a whole lot more detail. And it turned out that many of the women in those studies were started on HRT well after their menopause, so somewhere in their 60s, 70s or 80s, when they had hormones reintroduced back into a system that had essentially weaned off it. And we know when we do that, and the studies have been validated, this has been validated in animal studies, that when you do that, then you see the increased risk of all these diseases. But women who start taking hormone therapy in this window of opportunity, perhaps in their late 40s or early 50s, when their bodies haven't weaned off estrogen and they're very symptomatic, they're dealing with all the hot flashes or the brain fog or the anxiety, then that's quite a safe time to start that. And we understand, and the formulations used and the methods of delivery via sort of skin versus pill, etc., we're understanding a whole lot more now. So we understand when the timing is important and the type of formulation is important. But this is, it's really only been perhaps in the last 2 or 3 years that we're starting to understand this. So a lot of the older GPs are lagging behind with that education. And I know there's campaigns in the UK at the moment to provide more CPD education to the medical community around this. There are some really good women's health specialists who are offering women this, but also women aren't kind of aware of it themselves. There's this generation of women. Now over here in Australia, I'm seeing, and I'm in my mid-40s, I'm seeing women a few years ahead of me, certainly my friendship group, being far more open. So, hormone therapy is a thing, that's an option now, and people are far more open about discussing all of this than they even were 10 years ago. So I'm seeing a real open-mindedness and willingness to try hormone therapy as an option if you haven't got other risk factors precluding that, than, women I know who are 10 years older than me who are like, I'm not taking that because it causes cancer. So there is a shift. Sometimes these shifts just take a while, but I know that there's a lot of work going on in the UK. I believe I even read something. It was probably debating menopause in the House of Commons or something. I was like, what do they actually debate? So we're going to debate menopause. I was like, what's the angle here? Like, that is real? Or I think sometimes there's that lag there, and I think we're growing up. It's like you're in your late 40s. If you think you're symptoms, like you've got to show a bit of ownership over your own health sometimes when you go in, and it's a partnership that you have with a healthcare provider. You're not a child anymore. They're telling you how to behave. Women who do have that awareness also, have to go in and have those conversations if they are aware of it themselves. And I know there's a lot of good work being done. I believe that even in the UK there was a Davina McCall did a doco recently around that. Right. So that conversation is sometimes it's coming. And I just encourage, how well prepared are we when we go into a pregnancy? So many of us, we prepare our daughters entering puberty.
True. Yeah.
When we can't blame everyone else all the time. We do need to take a bit of ownership over that, because there's some really good information out there, and you're growing up going to your GP. You're not a 13-year-old naughty little girl. You can go and have a really good conversation with someone if you go in kind of informed. I believe that as well. So hopefully times are starting to change.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you. Great.
And it's and if I remember some of the numbers from your book correctly as well, like 20% of women will go through some pretty extreme symptoms, 60% of women will have some symptoms, and 20% it might barely register. So it's going to be quite a it's going to be quite an individual thing for somebody to actually choose to go through this as well.
Yeah. And sometimes it's either hushed up or not talking about. And older generations of women are like, well, we got through it, so why do you need to talk about it? And other women are like suffering and confused. So I just think all we can do is, the more information and education that's out there, and the awareness of the range of symptoms. It's like pregnancy. Some women sail through pregnancy. Other women are hospitalised, because they're, got such terrible morning sickness. So, there's and again, hormones are kind of driving the car here in a way, but they're in the driver's seat. But the more socially supported you are, the more information you've got, the more physically well you are, the better able you are to manage your sleep, to not let those sleep disturbances run away into insomnia. All of that, we've got to approach it using that holistic model as well.
Right.
And like across the lifespan is like, I like the way that you described it, which was windows of vulnerability. So you've talked about windows of opportunity as well, but this is the windows of vulnerability, which is at puberty, especially postpartum, and then during or perimenopause and menopause, that's when women are more susceptible to mental health disorders. So what do you think, what do you think are the best ways to try and buffer against those biological changes resulting in mental health conditions?
Yeah, well, I guess again it's awareness, having an understanding of what your normal is and what are the resources out there that you can use to pull on. And if someone doesn't have that agency or that ability to recognise it in themselves or to ask for help, and lots of people, I'm hopeless at asking for help, is for other people to, provide that, because often it's the social support that will then enable the other smart choices to be made. So just an awareness that these times of great change can be times of the emergence of wonderful wisdom and learning and new skills and new behaviours, and can be really amazing, but they do often leave us vulnerable because a lot of these neurological shifts. The teenage brain is undergoing structural reorganisation, so is the maternal brain, and so is the menopausal brain. And when that happens, things can sometimes go wrong. So it's just again awareness, education, and support.
Support is key. Brilliant.
Yeah, 100%. And I think just key to understand that if you that awareness piece is a big part of it, but also understanding that it's not something which is not supposed to happen. It's like in that these changes that you go through, like you can create extra stress for yourself by thinking, oh my God, these changes, it's making this happen, and you stress. And then it's like, it's awful. It's like, oh, maybe I shouldn't be thinking these things, maybe I shouldn't be feeling this way, but actually it's like, it's a pretty normal thing. And like going back to what you said about teenagers, when, they're moody, it's actually brilliant. This is developmentally normal. We want this to be kind of happening.
Yeah, and I think that's, it's going back to what we were saying at the very beginning of this conversation, that's certainly what science has offered me, and I hope offers other people, is the ability to sometimes to depersonalize and remove some of the shame and the personal storytelling from an experience, and it gives us the ability to step away from it and look at what is happening, and that gives us so many more options then to act if we understand what is going on, versus thinking it's something in here and sort of drowning within our own mind trying to figure it out.
Yeah. Okay. And I know, time-wise, we're almost up. We're approaching a hard stop. But I wanted to squeeze in one little question from one of our listeners. Okay, great. So I wanted to squeeze in a question from one of our listeners. So Jenna, thank you for submitting your question. And she was curious about imposter syndrome and why there seems to be a difference between men and women. If you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I do know someone who works in this space. If I had known this was coming, I would have looked up what their research is. I know plenty of men that have had imposter syndrome too. I'm not sure whether the personal experience of it is more prevalent in men and women. And again, there's probably a lot of things in play here. Women do tend to, girls, emerges during teenage years, tend to ruminate and self-reflect and sort of wallow around in ideas in our own minds, and there's a greater propensity for women to do that especially teenagers, to do that versus men. I remember when I headed off to Oxford, I had imposter syndrome. But when I talked about it, a few years down the track when I'd recovered, everyone I know had it. Like, you go somewhere like that, everyone thinks I'm not worthy. How did I end up here? They're going to find out. They shouldn't have let me in. And I think when you're in certain environments, foster it more than others. I think lots of women do find themselves perhaps in workplaces or environments where there's more men than women. Someone I've been in speaking to a lot of women in STEM who've perhaps gone into, say, the so-called harder sciences, physics, engineering, maths. They may have often been the only female in the room. And so then that feeds into a lot of that imposter syndrome, whereas a lot of the men may not have had that because they had their kind of male tribe with them. So again, there's lots of things in play. Context is a large part of that. And then, of course, that propensity to often sort of ruminate and wallow around an idea in our mind is something that girls and women have. But certainly I've struggled with it. And the thing that, I remember hearing Barack Obama saying he struggled with it. And I thought, well, if he struggled with it, like, everyone's going to struggle with it, right? It's just part of I believe it's kind of part of the human condition. And it's a social cognition, which is, what is everyone else thinking about me? There's that the thoughts of the crowd out there, the so-called imaginary crowd, and what if they find out that I'm not worthy? And is that's that kind of fear of non-approval of others? That's a pretty human state to be in. So I'm kind of talking around this because I'm not particularly aware of the research on this, although I know it is there, and I probably have not done it justice.
Sure. Well, I've heard like kind of conflicting things around it, very much in line with the way you were talking about it as well. But tell us about the Neuroscience Academy and the Brain Coach Bootcamp and the purpose of it and who it's for.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. I set the Neuroscience Academy and the Brain Coach Bootcamp are two online programs in applied science and brain health, which have identical curriculums. One is just slow-paced and more relaxed. So we've got 17 lessons taught over 12 weeks in the Neuroscience Academy. But the Brain Coach Bootcamp is a boot camp, so we smash those 17 lessons out over the course of 2 weeks.
Wow.
So we release lessons daily. So the course is structured whereby there are some online video lectures with, diagrams. It's kind of very theoretical with some practical application ideas, and then we have a Zoom group call to kind of chat, have a bit of a Q&A, have a bit of a chat about how we can apply this, or is there any new research which is relevant. And we kind of work our way through the basics of neuroscience, sort of starting off with the bottom-up, outside and top-down model, looking at neuroanatomy, physiology, cognition, emotion, get into aspects around kind of goal setting and reward and motivation that are really relevant for behaviour change. And then the kind of the last sort of third of the course is taking a look at these key indicators for brain health and mental well-being around, nutrition and exercise and purpose and social connection. So it's partly online learning based, whereby there's quite short sort of 10-15 minute video lectures to engage in, optional reading, and people come out of it with a certificate of applied neuroscience and brain health that they can then use as part of their professional development hours. So we're offering 35 hours all up now. And I have a lot of coaches come through, for example, psychologists, personal trainers, therapists, etc., who are really interested and enthusiastic about neuroscience and all it offers. Don't kind of know where to begin because it's an enormous field. And I sort of take them through because I think it's so important to build a really firm foundation and give people that firm foundation so that they can then go off and do some work or research of their own and start integrating what they've learned in really thoughtful ways into the work that they do.
Sounds fascinating.
For sure.
Really cool.
I get some amazing people who've gone through the program.
It's my next course, I promise you.
Good.
It's the next one. I love it.
We have amazing conversations. There's also a woman's a women's brain health and neurobiology course, which is kind of based on the book and the sort of lifespan approach to. We just sit around and it's mostly sort of conversation based. Just this great group of largely women talking about periods and pregnancy and menopause and from a neurobiological perspective. But that's similar type of, again, professional development training. That's, if you like it, to hang out and have a bit of a chat in a book club style. Talking about neuroscience books, of course, is that program as well, which I love. It's fun. And I get people in that. There's a quiz to sit the Neuroscience Academy, which is just an administrative tick box, but it does make people feel I've learned stuff and now I can describe my learning. But for the women's brain course, I get people to give a presentation on how they've taken what they've learned and the work they do. And that is the best thing ever. People have to give a 5-minute talk, almost like a mini TED talk, which again, people find challenging, but the stuff people, the work that people do that I get to work with blows my mind. I'm so humbled to be their teacher. It's really incredible.
Sounds fascinating. Oh, it's brilliant.
Yeah. I love that. I love the challenge of that as well. And throwing in a presentation at the end.
Yeah, it's good. I love it. You just sit back and have a glass of wine and watch.
Enjoy a TED talk.
Yeah.
That's great. And how can people reach you, Sarah?
Yeah, well, so my website is drsarahmckay.com, Sarah with an H, mckay.com, and you'll find links to the courses, the Neuroscience Academy, Brain Coach Bootcamp, etc. through that, and I spend a bit of time on Instagram. I've retired once again from Twitter, so you won't find me there. It's a negative, mean vibe. I'm over it. I keep re-engaging, and I don't need that negativity in my life anymore. Instagram's lovely, I follow botanical artists and all the positive. It's really positive, sort of giving space, and so that's where I kind of spend most of my time online. If anyone wants to connect via social,
and that's at Dr. Sarah McKay as well.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, wonderful. This has been a great conversation. We really enjoyed having you on. Thank you for joining us at 7 a.m. Sydney time.
Well, brilliant. Nearly 9 now. Well, honestly, thank you for the opportunity, because it feels very self-indulgent to be able to just chat with people who want to know what I think about stuff, and to talk about neuroscience and be interested and engaged and doing the good work that you guys are doing as well. It's very heartwarming for me. So thank you.
No, thank you. I appreciate that. So if you enjoy it that much, we'll definitely do it again at some point, hopefully.
Yeah, if I ever write another book.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's one of the things I wanted to talk to you about, but we ain't got time about. So
we'll do that offline. We'll do that offline.
Yeah, sure. But wonderful. So everybody else, thank you for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed the conversation. I hope you learned a lot from it, and tell us what you think about it as well if you really enjoyed it. And jump on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or Amazon Music or Google Podcasts, wherever you listen to podcasts, and subscribe to the show, and leave us a rating and review to tell us how much you enjoyed it. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.